my vintage clothes? There are three main places that I always go to. First is online, second, specialized vintage shops or vintage fairs, and the third one, second-hand or charity shops. When it comes to online shopping, that's basically my preferred method because it's easy. I can sort by size, decade, price, I can check the seller's reputation and the rating, and I can do it all in my pajamas. Specialized vintage shops and vintage fairs are great because you get to talk to the experts, the sellers that know their vintage. You can try them on, but the price might be higher. So how do we find vintage bargains? Well, you can find vintage bargains in second-hand and charity shop, but that means you need to know what you're looking at. You need to know how to identify vintage. The main thing that you can use to identify vintage is the silhouette. The first three images show the popular silhouettes in the 1920s, 1930s and 1940s. On the left, we see the 1920s silhouette. The flapper movement in this era means freedom from corsets and restrictive clothing. We see drop-waist dresses and beaded dresses that we now associate with Great Gatsby. 1930s see longer hem and maxi dresses with flatter sleeves. The old Hollywood glamour also influences this era. The defining style of the 1940s is the World War II silhouette. Shorter hem, less fabric, utility dresses, and practical clothing that follow the make-do and men movement. This second collage shows the popular styles in the 1950s, 1960s, and the 70s. The 1950s style is the one we often associate with vintage clothing nowadays. Celebration of the end of the war sees circle skirt, full skirt, Dior new look glamour, and fun fashion. The 1960s brings back the slim and A-line silhouette. The mod fashion sees miniskirt, scooter dresses, but still also have the 1950s glamour. The 1970s resonates with the flower children movement, which means we see maxi dresses with lots of fun colors and prints and bohemian clothing. So the second thing that you can use to identify vintage is prints or colors. This takes a long time to learn, but the more you wear vintage, the more familiar you will be. So as a guide, 1920s see a lot of Asian influence. 1940s see a lot of patriotic military influence. 1950s has a lot of novelty prints. So you often see full circle skirts with novelty prints, and you see Hawaiian or tiki prints. But remember, Hawaiian and tiki prints were also very popular in the 1980s. 1960s show a lot of hippie, bohemian floral prints. 1970s, paisleys. So this is an example of watercolor print that is popular in the 1950s and the 1960s. This is a 1950s dress depicting a prince and a farmer in very unusual color combination. So the third thing that you can use to identify vintage is the seams or the finishing. Overlock seams didn't become common until the 1960s. You see it in earlier decades, but it's quite rare. So everything else is usually hand finished. So this is an example of an overlock finishing. It didn't become popular until the 1970s, but you see this all the time in modern clothes. And this is the inside of a 1950s, 1960s dress. As you can see that the finishing inside is completely different. This was actually hand finished, unlike the overlock. Now that you have an idea of what decades your clothes might be, you might want to supplement this info with the type of material. 1930s and 1940s see a lot of rayon dresses. 1950s see a lot of cotton summer dresses, but you also see a lot of chiffons. Velvet was very popular in the 1930s and also again in the 1970s. Synthetics became very common in the 1960s, and you can only see nylon after the World War II. So the next thing that you can have a look at when thrifting is the label. Vintage clothes pre-1960s often have cursive writing. You don't see any care instruction or material type because that only comes in the 1970s. By care instructions, I mean how to wash it, how to iron it. You might also see the label that says juniors. Juniors is an old school term that basically means these clothes are tailored to teenagers. You might also have heard that union labels are really good to help you identify the different decades. Well, yes. I would suggest having a look at Vintage Fashion Guild website for resources on labels. The last thing that you can use to identify vintage clothes is the opening or the zipper. 1920s clothes didn't actually have any opening or any zipper, but most of the clothes you just have to pull it over your head. 1930s clothes usually use press studs. 1940s clothes see a lot of metal zipper. So when you buy 1940s dresses, the zipper is usually on this side, or when you buy a top, it might come with a neckline zipper at the back or on the sleeves. This is the back of a 1940s dress, which shows a metal zipper on the neckline and also on the side. 1950s show a lot of center zipper, so basically from this side and down. After the 1950s, the nylon zipper becomes very popular and you don't see metal zipper anymore. So I hope the next time you go thrifting, you can find yourself some really great vintage. Please let me know if this has been helpful and let me know what treasures you found. Bye! Thank you!